A net is tightening around some of Florida Governor Ron DeSantis' closest allies and aides as Republican lawmakers in the Florida legislature dig ever deeper into a scandal in which the DeSantis administration may have used a Casey DeSantis charity to turn $10 million of public money into funding for political campaign ads. We'll tell you more about what's happening next. Hello, and welcome to Seeking Rents, the podcast. I'm your host, Jason Garcia. I am the publisher of Seeking Rents, which is a newsletter in Florida about state politics, but with a particular emphasis on the ways that big businesses and other special interests influence public policy in this state. This is going to be an update from day 43 of the Florida legislature's 60-day legislative session. And it is pretty hard to talk about anything else right now other than Hope Florida and the rapidly escalating scandal involving Governor Ron DeSantis and some of his very closest aides and allies. And this scandal revolves around the potential use of $10 million in public money that was meant for the state's Medicaid system, the program that provides health insurance to very poor, elderly, and disabled Floridians, and taking that money and using it instead for essentially political campaign ads. And just to quickly recap, we covered this a bit on a show the other day, but last fall, the DeSantis administration orchestrated the transfer of $10 million in public money from a state contractor that had overbilled the state's Medicaid program, and as part of a legal settlement, had them make a $10 million donation to Hope Florida. That's the charity founded by the governor's wife, First Lady Casey DeSantis, potential gubernatorial candidate, 2026 gubernatorial candidate Casey DeSantis. Days after getting that $10 million, the Hope Florida Foundation turned around and gave $10 million, gave that exact $10 million to two dark money groups, giving $5 million each to an organization called Save Our Society from Drugs, which is an anti-marijuana group founded by a late Republican mega donor, and $5 million to Secure Florida's Future, which is a dark money political vehicle controlled by executives at the Florida Chamber of Commerce, the big business lobbying group. There's always a big business lobbying connection to everything that goes on up there, it seems like. Anyway, days after that, Secure Florida's Future and Save Our Society from Drugs rolled $8.5 million into Keep Florida Clean, which was a political committee set up and chaired by the governor's chief of staff that was raising money to campaign against Amendment 3. That was the amendment on last year's ballot that would have legalized recreational marijuana in Florida, allowed Floridians essentially to smoke marijuana recreationally rather than solely for medicinal purposes. And so yesterday, the House continued the House of Representatives continued to hold hearings trying to dig into this. And some of the things we learned is just sort of the centrality of James Uthmeier, who was the governor's chief of staff and is now the attorney general of Florida. So he was appointed attorney general by the governor, not elected, because the governor appointed the former attorney general, Ashley Moody, to fill the U.S. Senate seat vacated by Marco Rubio when Marco Rubio became Donald Trump's Secretary of State. So James Uthmeier was the governor's chief of staff last fall, also served in a dual fundraising role, chairing a couple of political committees that were personally important to the governor. Again, as I mentioned, Keep Florida Clean, which was specifically raising money to oppose Amendment 3, and also the governor's own personal political committee, the Florida Freedom Fund, which was raising money primarily last year to oppose both Amendment 3 and Amendment 4, which was the other citizen-led constitutional amendment on the ballot that would have overturned the state's abortion ban. And so among the things we've learned over the last couple of days is that James Uthmeier, approached both Secure Florida's Future, the Chamber of Commerce group, and Save Our Society from Drugs, and encouraged them, told them to request the money from Hope Florida Foundation, with the understanding, at least according to what one of the group's executives has told lawmakers, with the understanding that they would immediately turn around and give it to Keep Florida Clean, the political committee that Uthmeier was chairing, and chairing on behalf of the governor, by the way. He was doing this for the governor. The governor had made fighting Amendment 3 and Amendment 4 like essentially central to his legacy. He's betting his entire political future on his ability to beat the marijuana and abortion rights ballot measures. The other name that keeps coming up a lot now is a guy by the name of Jeff Aaron, who's essentially an attorney and a major DeSantis fundraiser. He co-chaired a super PAC that was set up for Ron DeSantis's failed presidential campaign. And he was hired as an attorney by the Hope Florida Foundation and essentially was involved in sort of creating all the paperwork for these grant proposals. That basically served as the lubricant to sending $10 million of Medicaid money through the Hope Florida Foundation to these dark money nonprofits and then potentially into campaign contributions. I say potentially as I don't believe any records have come out yet that have proven definitively that the $10 million that Hope Florida gave to those two nonprofits was also the money that was used to when they made donations to keep Florida clean. And also, by the way, the Florida Chamber of Commerce's vehicle, Secure Florida's Future, gave a bunch of money, essentially rolled a bunch of money into the Republican Party of Florida through other chamber committees as well, which RPOF was paying for ads for against both Amendment 3 and 4 too. Anyway, I'm down in the weeds a little bit here, but the names that the House seems to be circling in on are James Uthmeier and Jeff Aaron, and it looks like we're going to get more of this. The chairman of the House committee overseeing these hearings, a guy by the name of Alex Andrade, a Republican from the Pensacola area, has said he's going to have another hearing next week where he's going to invite Jeff Aaron plus the executives of Secure Florida's Future, which is the CEO of the Florida Chamber of Commerce and the head of Save Our Society from Drugs. He's going to invite them to come testify before his committee. He's also, at one point, he said he was going to subpoena James Uthmeier's texts and messages and stuff. It sounds like he's backed away from that a little bit and said he's going to request them for now and kind of just hold the subpoena power that the House has back behind, sort of hold that back as like a sword of Damocles over all this stuff, it seems like. So that's where we stand. This stuff just keeps spooling, and the circle seems to be getting ever tighter and right around the governor's most trusted people here. And now, you're talking about the attorney general of the state. So like one of the most powerful elected officials in the state is now swept up or directly implicated in all this. And I should say, one of the questions that's coming up is whether or not this stuff is illegal. And so Andrade and others, House Speaker Danny Perez have made a couple of comments saying that they think there was illegal activity here. I've actually spent quite a bit of time trying to unspool some of these dark money daisy chains that you see where money essentially gets laundered through several groups before it gets spent on political activities in a way. There's a number of reasons it happens. It helps to sort of make it impossible to discern the original source of the money. You create ways to commingle funds. It also helps these 501c4s, which are supposed to be, they're supposed to be public purpose nonprofits. It just helps them maintain the fiction that they are not just essentially dark money political vehicles. But the point is, it can be really challenging to prove that stuff is illegal. Part of the reason you create a paper trail is so that when someone calls you out on it, you can point to say, no, look, this wasn't a direction. This was a request. See, we asked in writing. We didn't tell them what to do. We just asked them what to do. And so you can look at something and sort of common sense tells you what's going on. When you have to actually like prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, that becomes much more tricky. The one area that seems to be unique here is this issue of where the 10 million originated from. So again, as I mentioned, this involved Centene Corp, which is the state's largest Medicaid contractor. Essentially operates, the state of Florida has largely privatized its Medicaid program. Centene is the largest sort of manager of that program now, private manager. Centene overbilled the state by at least $67 million, it seems. And the state eventually negotiated a legal settlement. And as part of that legal settlement, I believe I have this right, they paid some amount of money. They paid all but 10 million back to the state, but then 10 million, instead of paying it to the state, they made a donation, quote unquote donation. Centene is told they were instructed to make that. They made that donation to Hope Florida. And so now, normally when there's a lawsuit settlement, that money, there are like strict laws around how that money gets spent. It's got to come back in and essentially the legislature reappropriates it. The executive branch, which does not control the power of the purse strings, is not supposed to be able to sort of make spending decisions on its own. The wrinkle here is they did this as a pre-suit settlement. They settled before a lawsuit was filed over this disputed overbilling stuff. And so there are going to be like legal questions around whether or not the DeSantis administration broke the law about appropriating money without the legislature's oversight, or whether or not this pre-suit settlement sort of two-step that they did here is enough to sort of circumvent that. So that strikes me, at least of what we know so far, one of the most potentially vulnerable points here for everybody involved. Also, there's just like a whole pile of missing paperwork and it sounds like documents being backdated. One of the low-key more interesting details out of this is the Hope Florida Foundation has a board of directors run by essentially a bunch of government DeSantis administration contractors and lobbyists, but that they've had several meetings. I think it was three meetings, and they never kept minutes of any of their meetings until their most recent one, where they approved this settlement situation, this accepted this money and moved these grants on. It's the sort of thing that, like, if you were trying to invent a paper trail to cover your tracks, that's the sort of thing you would expect to see. So, learning that detail, that this was the only time they decided to have minutes of their meeting, was pretty interesting. More to come, obviously. The other point I wanted to make regarding this, and I wrote this in a piece on the newsletter, though, is that whether or not this is illegal, this obviously looks very bad. You essentially have a daisy chain financial transaction here that, like I said, appears to have turned $10 million that was meant to provide health insurance for, poor, disabled, and elderly Floridians, and turned it into anti-marijuana political ads. Whether or not it's illegal, it looks very bad. But this is also part of a broader pattern. And this is what I wrote about. This is what I wrote about earlier on the newsletter. And so I'm gonna just go through this. Like, just think about what we already know about how Ron DeSantis financed his campaigns last year against those two amendments: Amendment 3, the marijuana amendment, and Amendment 4, the abortion rights amendment. Basically, using millions of dollars of public money taken from taxpayers, but also private money taken from donors who got public favors from the governor. So beyond this Hope Florida $10 million, we already know that at least 5 state agencies spent taxpayer money directly on television ads against these amendments. We still, to this day, don't know exactly how much the state spent or where it pulled all this money from, these 5 agencies. Seeking Rents has spent a lot of time trying to dig through this stuff. We've estimated the total spending by these agencies at something like $20 million. That's based on, like, what details we can glean from purchase orders and vendor invoices that we've been able to obtain. We got a pile of public records requests in around this. The DeSantis administration has largely ignored them so far. We're still waiting on these. We've been waiting on these for months already. But one thing we already know about that is that the DeSantis administration paid for at least some of its anti-marijuana advertising using funding from Florida's share of the nationwide settlement with the opioid industry. This is money that they are supposed to be spending combating the opioid addiction crisis. So there's a giant red flag right there. We also know, similar to this Hope Florida situation, another taxpayer-funded nonprofit started doing a bunch of TV ads that were suspiciously complimentary of the state's advertising against Amendment 4, the abortion rights amendment. In this case, it was the Florida Pregnancy Care Network. It gets nearly $30 million a year in state taxpayer money to essentially steer people into anti-abortion pregnancy centers. Counseling centers is what these are, really. They call them clinics, but they're not medical clinics. The Florida Pregnancy Care Network, we have learned since the campaign, spent at least $5 million on TV ads that essentially complemented the state's own advertising, right down to using the same slogan. These were the first ever TV ads the Florida Pregnancy Care Network ever did. They were overseen by the DeSantis administration specifically. The Pregnancy Care Network has said everything it did was approved by the DeSantis administration. They even used this really suspicious, mysterious vendor that, when you crack inside the public records, what little are available, sure seems to track back to have some connections to the main advertising vendor that was doing all of the DeSantis and the anti-Amendment 3 and Amendment 4 campaign advertising. So you got that. So you got something like $20 million from state agencies. You got another $5 million at least from this taxpayer-funded nonprofit. You got the $10 million from Hope Florida now, or the Medicaid settlement funneled through Hope Florida. But then you've also, like, I don't know if folks remember this, but last summer, right after Ron DeSantis vetoed legislation that had passed the legislature last session, that would have imposed these strict regulations on the hemp industry, CBS News in Miami obtained a bunch of text messages that showed that industry executives and lobbyists for the hemp industry had promised to raise $5 million in exchange for that veto for the governor to spend on his anti-Amendment 3 campaign. And this story had this had text messages from folks. I'm just going to read a couple of here. One, quote, our lobby team made promises to rally some serious funding to stand with him on this. Hemp industry representative wrote in one of these text messages, a message that, by the way, included the bank routing number for the Republican Party of Florida. Another message said, quote, we have to pay $5 million to keep our end of the veto. All of that happened last summer, right? And then more recently, this is one we just learned about on the newsletter, and I think we've talked about on the show. In the closing weeks of the campaign, one of the very biggest donors to the governor's personal political committee, the Florida Freedom Fund, was Philip Morris International, the big tobacco giant that everybody knows as the maker of Marlboro cigarettes. They gave $500,000 to DeSantis's personal political committee, which, again, chaired by none other than James Uthmeyer, the then chief of staff, who is now Florida's attorney general. Well, a few weeks after the election, just recently, the DeSantis administration turned around and handed Philip Morris this giant tax break, essentially ruling that the administration would not collect the tobacco taxes on Philip Morris's IQOS product, which is essentially an electronically heated product that heats tobacco sticks. It won't charge tobacco tax on this. That ruling was suspicious for a number of reasons, including the fact that the DeSantis administration, up until that point, had said these things were taxable, including the fact that this ruling, which was issued by the state's Division of Alcoholic Beverages and Tobacco, clearly flew in the face, violated an appellate court ruling that came down on the exact opposite side of this issue involving a different tobacco product called hookah. And by the way, do you know who Philip Morris hired to be its lawyers when it petitioned the DeSantis administration for this tax break? Jeff Aaron, the other guy that is showing up in this Hope Florida scandal. So I say all of this to, again, emphasize that there's like a giant pattern of abuse that we have seen, or potential abuses in some cases, obvious abuses in others. And this all happened when Ron DeSantis made the decision to turn the power of state government against two citizen-led constitutional amendments. And just remember here, all we are talking about right now is the money part of this. You might remember that DeSantis and his team also threatened to criminally prosecute television stations that aired amendments supporting, or that aired TV commercials supporting the abortion rights amendment. They sent state police to the home of voters of Florida voters who signed the Amendment 4 petition to interrogate them about their decision to sign. They even hijacked the ballot writing process. We talked about this in the context of where this was where they were helped by the state, and they literally gave a taxpayer funded job to a Heritage Foundation fellow, a person from the Project 2025 organization, so that she could help write the ballot language for Amendment 4. Yeah, I don't know if I've ever talked about this on this podcast, although we have in the newsletter, but there is a reason why when Ron DeSantis' administration negotiated a legal settlement with the group that sponsored Amendment 4 after the election, they made sure to extract a promise of legal immunity from that group. Basically, a promise that group would not sue them or challenge any of the actions the DeSantis administration took during the election. They knew that they were at best blurring lines all over the place, and I would argue there's more than enough evidence here that they were breaking laws in different places. There is a wildfire's worth of smoke around this. So now the House hearings have been focused entirely on this Hope Florida element, the $10 million Medicaid money making its way into anti-marijuana advertising. But they've requested a whole pile more records. They're still digging deep into this. It is entirely possible, it seems to me, that we will eventually see, if they succeed in pulling records out of the administration, detailed records, that we'll start to climb into some of these other examples and probably even more we don't even know about yet. So this scandal has in the last couple of days come to just like consume the legislative session. It is leading places where I can't remember if I said this the other day. I'm somewhat curious about how much the House leadership knew about what they would find when they started off down this path. It sort of feels like they struck a gold mine. So you sort of wonder if they knew they were fishing where the fish were or something like that. But who knows? But good on them for getting this much information. And here's hoping that they pull out even more details, because this is taxpayer money. These are public resources. Floridians deserve to know exactly what the DeSantis administration has done with it all. The other thing I want to mention yesterday, so we talked about in the podcast the other day about how the weird the sort of wild card here is the Florida Senate. So just to sort of put a finer point on, well, the House was holding this hearing yesterday on Hope Florida and digging even deeper into this. Ron DeSantis was giving like just an absolutely unhinged press conference in Pensacola where just railing at the House. I think at one point he was quoting Shakespeare, going after House Republicans and essentially accusing them of backstabbing voters, as if trying to figure out if state officials have been involved in a significant money laundering scheme is somehow backstabbing takes state taxpayers. The wild card in all this, as we mentioned the other day, though, is the Florida Senate, which has been kind of standing on the sidelines ever since the special session where the House and Senate teamed up to sort of body Ron DeSantis in a really strong way and kind of like reel in some of his sort of like personal abuses in terms of using state powers to further his own political ambition. In that case, in an immigration context, the Senate has largely kind of been more of a neutral figure and sort of being very careful not to sort of take sides or antagonize either the House or the governor as the sort of relations between House leadership and the governor have increasingly deteriorated as they sort of shake this tree. But there are a few things that happened yesterday that I thought were really sort of interesting in the Senate that, again, we're reading tea leaves here, but potentially could be really significant. So the first is the governor has been pushing this bill trying to get this bill through the session, essentially codifying Hope Florida into law. That Hope Florida is like, you want to understand how it's just sort of like weird this whole situation is. Just watch DeSantis administration officials try to explain what Hope Florida is. It's like trying to hold water in your hands. It's sort of this kind of amorphous idea in many ways rather than like actual execution, it seems like sometimes. But the administration has been pushing this bill trying to codify Hope Florida and create an office and some dedicated employees. That bill has kind of been slowly moving, not dead, but slowly moving. The Senate abruptly postponed a hearing on it yesterday. Now, it makes total sense. The Senate president was asked about that after a Senate floor session and said, just with everything going on with what the House is discovering, we just don't want to let that process play out. We figured we'd take a break on that. Makes total sense. That explanation doesn't necessarily signify anything, but it was interesting. But then also that day, a different Senate committee essentially shot down the nomination of a former state rep to the board of a state college in the Pensacola area, a guy by the name of Joel Doc Rudman. This story is actually somewhat insane. This guy is unhinged. He went on. He's been sort of very firmly on Team DeSantis and sort of like essentially accusing House Republicans of just going after him for political ambition reasons of their own. He's kind of turned on the House where he used to serve. Anyway, he went on, I think it was like a Twitter Spaces or whatever the fuck Elon Musk is calling Twitter Spaces at this point, and essentially threatened the Senate committee that was going to hold a hearing on his confirmation yesterday, because state college appointees, they're appointed by the governor, but they got to be confirmed by the Florida Senate. And I don't have the exact transcript of me, but he basically alluded to like having knowledge of members of the Florida legislature using drugs, but he wasn't going to say more because he had a confirmation hearing coming up on the Senate. He wanted to see how they behaved themselves before he decided just how much knowledge he wanted to spread, how much before he wanted to get it there. He explicitly threatened the Senate before this hearing. So the perhaps not surprisingly, the Senate committee, the Senate Higher Ed Appropriations Committee, I think it was, rejected his nomination unanimously. And this guy, I just want to say that this guy is a coward. So he appeared remotely because he had been with Ron DeSantis at this unhinged press conference that I mentioned earlier. And so he appeared remotely to testify. And Senator Tom Leek, a Republican from the Daytona Beach area, actually, who served with Rudman in the House. So like good on Leek for not like ignoring this issue, read these quotes back to him and asked him to sort of explain why he thought he could threaten senators into, and rather than owning up to what he said, this guy Doc Rudman, rather than sort of admitting what he'd said and either defending it or acknowledging that he made a mistake, he tried to pretend he didn't say it. He claimed he was only talking about the House, that he did not threaten the Senate. It was the most cowardly thing you'd ever, the ultimate kind of keyboard warrior thing, where this guy was plenty happy to talk a big game when he was on a safe Twitter space with a bunch of people that were going to just sort of nod their heads and enjoy the show. But when he actually got called on what he said in a place where, if you really had something to say, this would have been an impactful place to say it. He tried to pretend that he'd never said it and tried to laugh it off. He'd give a nervous laugh when Tom Leake started to ask about this. It was just, it was pathetic is what it was. Anyway, so the Senate committee voted him down. The confirmation process is such that I think his confirmation is still alive. It just gets a negative recommendation. So he hasn't officially been rejected yet, but he's going to be at this point. Now, again, kind of like the Hope Florida thing, this is in isolation, it makes sense. This guy, as Tom Leake pointed out in this hearing, this guy left the Senate no choice but to reject him. You cannot publicly blackmail senators into approving your confirmation. They had no choice but to reject him, and everybody knew that. I mean, unless this guy's seen you do drugs, you're trying to keep him shut up. There's literally, you have no option but to vote against this guy. He left you no choice. So again, this one in isolation, maybe just a one-off. But then a third thing, another kind of minor thing, but that struck me as related to all this. The Senate President's Office announced yesterday that essentially the Trump administration had endorsed the Senate's Rural Renaissance Package. We've alluded to this or talked a little bit about this in the past. This is a bill that's already come out of the Senate. It seems like probably the top personal priority, at least publicly, the top personal priority of the Senate President, Ben Albrecht, and a guy from one of the most rural parts of the state. This is a giant package of spending and other programs and stuff that's designed to essentially help rural areas, improve quality of life in rural areas, expand access to medical providers, healthcare services, expand access to education opportunities, schools, that sort of thing, and to improve like technology, like broadband and stuff in rural communities. So, and they got the Trump administration to essentially endorse this. I'm somewhat like glossing over details, but they got the Trump administration to essentially endorse this rural renaissance package. And on one level, it makes sense. This is I don't have the vote in front of me, but I'm sure rural renaissance passed unanimously. It is. I've read the bill. I don't find anything objectionable in it. I find most of it very good. I think this whole notion of trying to help rural areas without putting pressure on them to develop and turn them into suburban areas or exurban areas is a really good idea. It's a noble idea. We want people in these communities to be able to control their own fate, but also to have access to the same sort of quality of life things that people have in other areas. There's like no doubt that this is a bill that has broad support, politically popular. But if you were looking ahead to sort of like an end game, it's possible the way session is evolving that things end really badly between the legislature and the governor in terms of like especially if the Senate ends up coming down with the House in terms of passing some of these legislation, these bills we've talked about before that would really like curtail some of the governor's powers and rein in some of his abuses around, essentially campaigning on with public resources, essentially inserting political control into state universities and partisan weaponizing university boards, that sort of thing. If the Senate ultimately decides to go along with a lot of that stuff, you could be looking at a situation where Ron DeSantis just goes on the war path against the legislature. And one of the things you would probably do is veto everything that you could find that was important to the people running the Florida legislature, like rural renaissance. Again, incredibly important bill, good bill. Nobody's really against it, but you could come up with a spending reason, like this is government bloat or something like that. You could invent a reason if you wanted to. So this announcement that the Trump administration was on board with it struck me as a bit of an example of buying a little bit of a veto insurance policy, that you would be going against Trump by vetoing that bill. Again, I might be overreading, but you take those three things together: Senate postponing the Hope Florida bill, shooting down Doc Rudman's nomination, especially when Rudman has become so closely linked now to Ron DeSantis' war with the Florida House, and then essentially taking steps to get Trump's blessing on the rural renaissance package on a bill that is so important to the Senate president. All of those things, these are the sorts of steps you would expect to see if the Florida Senate was ultimately going to end up in a place where it was aligning with the House against the governor in the endgame. Again, this is all tea leaf reading. I could be way off. I've overread and misread tea leaves many times in the past, but as I was watching everything unfold yesterday, those things all jumped out to me as really interesting. And we'll know in a week or two how significant or not those developments were. The last thing I'll say from yesterday, the Florida Senate also passed a bill we have talked about before, not in a while though. Senate Bill 832. This is a bill being lobbied for by the Mosaic company, the industrial giant. It strip mines phosphate ore in southwest central Florida and turns it into fertilizer at chemical factories, primarily around the Tampa Bay region. This bill essentially gives Mosaic legal defenses against lawsuits alleging impacts from radioactive contamination left behind in formerly mined areas. So phosphate mining, just as a quick sort of explanation, phosphate mining, you're essentially strip mining the ground and digging up phosphate ore that is usually buried between 30 and 50 feet below ground. Maybe it's 20 and 50 feet, something like that. Phosphate ore has some naturally radioactive elements in it. I believe uranium is in there. There's something else. Anyway, it's mildly radioactive. And in phosphate mining, you are required to reclaim land once you're done essentially strip mining it, and which basically means like refilling in all the canyons you've just dug and sort of restoring the land to some sort of like a rough facsimile of its former state. But that process, you end up moving some of this, like you've got leftover phosphate rock that didn't get sort of collected or processed, like this mildly radioactive stuff. Suddenly that's stuff that had been like 20 to 50 feet below the surface is now much closer to the ground, to the surface level. And so the radioactive levels on formerly mined phosphate land are a little bit higher than on sort of regular ground. Now there's lots of arguments about whether or not it's still within safe levels, whether it's still within what like a lot of times they'll call like baseline levels. There is a lawsuit going right now against Mosaic in Hillsborough County Court in Tampa Bay, where it is a potential class action suit brought by some mobile homeowners alleging impacts from the radioactive contamination on where they live, which is built on former phosphate mine land, reclaimed phosphate mine land. So this legislation, Senate Bill 832, would give Mosaic more defenses in those kinds of cases. I'll throw a link. We did a deep dive into this bill before session started, so I'll throw a link to that in the story. You can sort of understand more of the components of it because it hasn't really significantly changed at all through the process. Anyway, it went through the Florida Senate yesterday. The Florida Senate passed it on a 33-3 vote, so that was pretty broad support. The state's big regulated industries, Mosaic, sugar, the utilities, they do a really good job of cultivating support from both parties. So that bill is through the Senate now, waiting in the House. This is an interesting one in that it seems pretty clear this is another bill that is very important to Ben Albritton, the Senate president, who has been a reliable ally of Mosaic in the past and sort of defending them in places where they run into a lot of local opposition because phosphate mining is such an environmentally destructive activity. He has defended them in the past. So this seems like one of those bills. The House is moving its bill and is probably, I expect it will pass, but I also expect this is a bill that's going to sit until the very end game of session, probably because I would assume this is one of those bargaining chips at this point. I could be wrong about it, but that's how it feels to me. So, okay, I've rambled on long enough again for this show. We'll be back again tomorrow, Friday, hopefully, with another update from the rest of session or from the latest in session. And until then, just as always, make sure to click like and subscribe. If you can, leave a review or a comment. And if you haven't already, subscribe at seekingrentsfl.com for the newsletter. Thanks so much, and we'll talk again soon. Take care.